Welcome, everyone. My name is Chris Bailey, editor, and I am pleased to be moderating our first session as well as welcoming you to today's Modern Enterprise Cloud Security Summit, brought to you by Rubix. The editorial staff of RedmanMag.com and Virtualization and Cloud Review have worked hard to bring together some of the best independent experts on this topic for this event, so we really hope you enjoy it. Before we start today's event with these three great sessions, we do have some announcements. First, we wanted to let you know that this event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing. You'll receive an email when the replay is available, generally within the next few days. Each of today's three sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A, so please be sure to put your questions into the Q&A area of your console as they come up. During today's third session, we will be giving away a DJI Air 2S drone, but you must be present to win. So be sure to stay on for the entire event. Finally, we do have resources from our sponsor Rubrik available on the console right now, so please download and check those out. It's because of Rubrik's underwriting of this content that we can bring you this summit. So we thank them for sponsoring and supporting the community and ask you to check out these resources so we can bring you more events in the future. Now on to the first session of today's summit, Enterprise Cloud Security Threat Landscape, a 50-minute overview. This session features Ian Thornton-Trump, CISO of CyJax. Ian is an ITIL certified IT professional with 25 years of experience in IT security and information technology. Ian has served with the Canadian Forces Military Intelligence Branch, joined the CF Military Police Reserves, and retired as a public affairs officer. After a year with the RCMP as a criminal intelligence analyst, Ian worked as a cybersecurity analyst and consultant for multinational insurance, banking, and regional healthcare companies. Take it away, Ian.
Thank you so much, Chris, and a huge shout out to our sponsor, Rubrik, for letting me talk about this one, because actually this one, folks, is a special one. And it's mostly because, when you're asked to do a threat landscape, sort of the default setting that a lot of people have is like the bad guys and APT this and cyber criminal group this. But this one, I decided to go in a completely opposite direction and talk about what in my mind is sort of the absence of those threats and the situations that we find ourselves in enterprise security today. Whether you're cloud, whether you're on-premise, or whether you're in hybrid hell, I'm going to really dig down today and talk about the things that are on my mind, and not just my mind. These are other people that I've had conversations with, candid conversations about how things fell apart for them or how very bad things happened. And there is a lot of data that I'm going to share with you guys today, but I've also taken my deck in a different direction than I normally do because I'm going to use a lot more visuals. And absolutely a shout out to the beer farmers who are going to be putting on BeerCon 4 live at the DTX London show. It will be live streamed. We'll have guests from all over the world in the cybersecurity community. So check that out online. You can always follow me at @fat_hobbit. And I'm on LinkedIn too, and I'm pretty easy to find because I think I'm the only Thornton-Trump that's out there. So let's talk about now the 9 things that are the most dangerous. And I, put some NASDAQ up there because I know my audience. But where I'm finding that things are falling apart are really broken down into sort of 9 problems that cybersecurity at the enterprise level has, and this does even bleed down into that mid-market, it bleeds down to MSPs. It is a generic problem that we're faced with, and that, of course, is security leadership. Being a leader is different from being a practitioner, which is different from being a manager. And I think, there's a bunch of work that we can do there. In fact, I give about a 50-minute presentation on cybersecurity leadership and the things that I've learned over my 20 or so, 25 years or so of industry exposure, right? The other thing we're going to have some frank discussions about budget because, vision without resources is by very definition hallucination. So again, what we're going to talk about is not so much how to budget, but how to start figuring out how to spend other people's money to advance your security, to bring things that are red in your heat map up to amber or green, okay, or yellow, as they say. But the point here, the discussion around budget, I'm going to dive into that because, again, it's key in trying to move any sort of initiative forward, right? The other problem that I see all too often is the DRBCP is sometimes, not completely, but if you as a security team or security leader are not looking at the daily disaster recovery or backup report, again, availability, folks. CIA triangle, we can go through that all day. I can do a 50-minute presentation just on that alone. But the DRBCP posture of your organization is absolutely critical, and especially in the times of ransomware that we're faced with. And then we have the legacy infrastructure that we're going to discuss because in a lot of cases, one of the most impactful things you can do is help influence the IT security roadmap or the IT lifecycle management process within your organization. We're going to talk about and have a pretty uncandid discussion on technological debt. We've been doing things the wrong way for quite some time, and this is actually sort of these three things: the technological debt, the lack of architecture resources, i.e. not fixing the sins of the past, if you will, and your attack surface visibility are all intrinsically linked, okay? These are things that are actually what I would call the quick wins in cybersecurity, and my role in this webinar today is to talk not only about, how you're going to get owned because you had a Confluence instance that's like, publicly on the internet, that's a terrible idea, or a VM portal to manage VMs that have been opened up to the internet again to manage your virtual machine infrastructure. All very terrible things. We're gonna have a discussion on that as well. The data sprawl that we have. There is a certain level of agility that IT and IT security can achieve if they are aware of the size of and vulnerability of the data within the organization. And I mean, anyone that has tried to do a data classification exercise within your organization or tried to start corralling data, it is a difficult battle. I think this is probably one of the areas which is not only really impactful to cybersecurity in general, but is the biggest challenge that we face. And I say this with all honesty because it's the data that is being exfiltrated by the bad guys that is going to be used to entice you to pay the ransom. And in fact, some ransomware crews have dispensed with the ransomware altogether and are just doing the data exfil part and trying to extort a ransom out of your organization. I said I wasn't going to talk about ATPs and cyber criminals, but I cannot not talk about APTs and cyber criminals. And then, of course, we have our third-party applications and the type of exposures that we're going to face with, which in a way is an IT security problem, but in a way it isn't. It's like a major business problem because if they pick a terrible partner for their ERP application that has like no security, well, is that really something that the IT security department can even sort of like be responsible for? There's some real questions around governance and risk too that all fall out of that discussion. So let's talk about security leadership first, okay? Now, I'm not going to go, and do all the whole black turtleneck TED Talky thing here. All I'm going to say is that when we look at technology and we talk about it, and everyone on this webinar probably knows that we try to break it down into people, processes, and technology. I do it a little bit differently. I talk about people and processes, but I also talk about procedures because in a lot of cases, procedures can fix some of the potential risk within your organization without just going to the technology. So despite that, even if there is a third sphere, excuse me, folks, on this Venn diagram, the reality is that security leadership has to keep those spheres from drifting, like tectonic plates, right? Because what do we get when a tectonic plate drifts? We get a giant volcano of data coming out of that drift. So security leadership is about keeping all of these things aligned, even though your organization is going to be in a state of flux. Some organizations move from crisis to crisis to crisis, right? Other organizations are franking organizations where new brands are acquired and integrated within the organization, where you get some new IT manager that knows it all trying to tell you, the purchasing company, how things work. It can go sideways really quickly. That's the people part of this equation. People can be difficult. But the reality is that security leadership is about tying these things and keeping them together. And if your organization is drifting, if the processes are not understood, the people are difficult and not engaged, no matter how much technology you throw at the problem, your risk will be absolutely high. And part of leadership, and I have to say this, is taking responsibility for the organization. So if you're Joe Sullivan, you're in a heap of trouble, because what happened here was you decided to abdicate your responsibility and ended up getting charged by the American government for some pretty terrible things. So to give you the summary of it, the details are essentially that a data breach was covered up by Uber. Uber has admitted this publicly already. However, the criminal prosecution of Joe Sullivan continues as a result of obfuscation and obstruction of justice, and, of course, a new charge that a lot of folks in the audience have never heard of before, called misprision by felony. Misprision by felony is where a crime has occurred, but you fail to report it. This case is super important. Happening in California, the outcome of this case could absolutely rock the cyber world in terms of the responsibility and the importance of disclosing a data breach and not attempting to cover it up. So this is the one to watch, folks, because at this point, this is where the game gets real, that there's actual I would say, blood in the water here that the sharks are being attracted to. So even though, this case is one that I would say is predicated on a lot of, evidence, the biggest problem that we have in IT is, does this meet a criminal standard of evidence, or is it more of a reasonable probability as opposed to beyond reasonable doubt? So this is a key moment in cybersecurity leadership that is all about doing the right thing if your business has been hit or has been attacked in cybersecurity. And as a result of this, we may see a mandatory reporting requirement, especially for companies that are publicly listed, or hell hath no fury, like a shareholders class action lawsuit. So we'll leave Joe here and wish him the best, but this is a case that I think will have massive repercussions in the future. Right, the security budget. So the security budget in most organizations for a CISO breaks down something like this. About 70% of your budget is going to be spending on the people, on your team, okay? With about 20% just on the renewals of your software, okay? So in the security world, if you've got Splunk, if you've got whatever tools that you have deployed within your organization, you are going to have to annually renew them. Now, I have some good news to share with you folks on that front, but I'm going to, I'll put a little pin in that one because I want to talk about the reality on the ground, which means most CISOs only have about 10% of their budget to get all experimental and try out new things. So the key to selling into the security space is to say, how much do you spend on security tools that do X, Y, and Z? Our security tool can actually do X, Y, and Z plus A, B, and C, which will give you the same functionality you actually have, but reduce your costs because you are going to be able to leverage these new capabilities in addition to your old capabilities. That's the pitch right now that is working. The fear and uncertainty and doubt about Russian global cyber war is not working. Okay, despite some companies' best effort to put that out as the narrative, and then, we transition to the Chinese are bad, and then, oh, look, North Koreans are, doing cyber attacks too, and are in your browser. I know this because I commented recently on an article that came out with this. The bottom line here is, for the CISO who's under budgetary pressure, you need to figure out how you're going to spend other people's money, not your money, to achieve your security results. Now, I did say I was going to put a pin in this one because the reality is now, and we've seen this with several of the other webinars that I've given for Redmond Channel Partners, there is a giant sort of merge, if you will, taking place in cybersecurity. There is a recognition that you can't do IT without doing IT security, and that the IT security cannot exist without the participation, engagement, and a shared common tool set between the IT department and the cybersecurity department, right? So this is why, I see it merging into IT operations, and it should be IT sec operations, so IT security operations, and risk and governance. Security right now is sitting sort of as an awkward stepchild with one foot in the governance and risk world, right, which is inhabited by your auditors, your internal audit people, your counsel's office, sometimes bleeding over into the marketing department, et cetera, and then the actual operations of the business that is, held by IT and your analysts, your networking people, your server admin, your desktop team. This is the dysfunction in a lot of organizations today. So when you are sitting in a security silo, as I like to say, what you need to do is figure out how you can leverage the existing tool sets that your IT department is using, and perhaps even the reports that the governance and risk and audit people are putting together, and figure out a way how to leverage that instead of going in and saying, well, we need a security agent on a desktop, but we also need an IT management agent on a desktop. What we really need to figure out here is how do we get the visibility that we need, potentially even going down the whole zero trust route of automation and orchestration. But how do we get there with the meager budget that we have, which, is going to be difficult to say, well, we've just added another 250 workstations this year because of our unprecedented growth, and I'm out of licensing to deploy EDR on those endpoints, right? So we have this perpetual cycle that becomes really difficult if security is looking at itself in isolation, okay? So learn to spend other people's money so that you can advance your security done. Now, number 3, the DRBCP. So firewall, right? We all know what happened when DigitalOcean had that unfortunate incident where one of their data centers burned to the ground. And a lot of organizations, nothing gets on the radar faster than, to talk about DRBCP that's setting the building on fire across from your data center, right? So this is a chance now for IT and IT security to really come together. This is the thing that I feel is like the big table discussion, and it can really draw in and really be super helpful for the organization in general to show a bit of unity when it comes to looking after the data that you've been entrusted to. Now, I know IT and IT security like to go with the mantra, well, the business owns the data. Let's face it. The business may own it, but they have no clue about it, and they probably don't even know where it lives. That is an IT and a security responsibility, especially when you talk about the availability piece of that CIA triangle. But more importantly, I think from the IT operations perspective, the DRBCP is really something that needs encouragement and support from security. So cross silos, if you want to build out a sort of relationship with IT and really get them on board, help them help themselves by gaining visibility and supporting, DR. As an MSP, the report that I want to see daily is on the status of all my customers back in Canada of whether or not we've had a successful backup that evening of all of the data that's in the place. that's super important for me for my peace of mind, because DR is literally the Alamo. It is the last resort for the organization. And, this will lead us into a discussion on some other things very shortly, but I will say this: if you don't have visibility on the disaster recovery posture of your organization, you're going to probably be terribly surprised. And sometimes IT and IT security like surprises, like a surprise cake, right? We love a surprise cake, or surprise hot dogs, or a surprise pizza. What we don't like is a surprise when we thought a bunch of servers were getting backed up, and it turns out they weren't. That is like the not good surprise at all. Now, we turn our evil eye of Mordor, again, Lord of the Rings reference there, to the legacy infrastructure. In a lot of cases, your management team within the building confines, their only visibility is, the IT that exists in that building. They don't have a clue about the struggles that exist in terms of IT outside of that building, okay? So what I'm talking about here is your branch offices. I'm talking about, like, your legacy infrastructure that hasn't been properly looked after. And I'm going to give a huge shout out to my buddy Brian Wheaton, who gave me some of these pictures because he's collected a whole bunch of stuff that he's encountered or he's found online to really illustrate what we're talking about here. And one of the most fundamental pieces that can be done is actually focusing, again, not only on the availability issue, but bringing things up to a certain level that you can actually leverage some of the technology that exists out there to, secure your organization. Right? If you don't have managed switching, it's going to be impossible for you to do VLANs. If there's no way for you to remotely control any of that managed infrastructure, it's going to be really costly and expensive, right? Because when you look at having to pay your folks mileage in order to go, halfway across the state or, to another city, that is a really expensive cost that isn't very efficient in terms of how you're doing IT operations. So one of the biggest and most powerful tools is to get those branch managers on side with you, get them to send pictures of the infrastructure that they're working with, and use that to coerce the budget powers of saying, hey, we really have to address this. But at the same time we're going to address this, let me put some new technology in there that brings us closer to the nirvana of remote, management, but also putting in new security features that might be more beneficial to the organization. We're dealing with, back in Canada, an organization right now that wants to remove branch office servers, mostly because they're on old, dodgy hardware, but also because the operating systems are out of date. We want to remove those and go with a central Active Directory with, of course, the appropriate backups. But the goal here is that the reason why those servers were there in the first place is low bandwidth between sites. Now bandwidth is relatively inexpensive. You can do MPLS, you can do point-to-point VPN, but you can get Active Directory replicating easily on 17 meg up and 100 meg download, which is almost a universal standard. So the point here that I'm saying is a simple upgrade in the technology of your legacy infrastructure can be a huge security win. And again, that is not necessarily coming out of the security budget here. This is thinking about how do I infiltrate a IT lifecycle management project and upgrades that are going on at the branch and get the most bang for the buck when it comes to security, right? Okay. Now, the technological debt. Now, I shared this slide with a bunch of my coworkers, and they started with the peals of laughter. Because if you've been in this industry for a while, you know things like Paradox, you know things like Borland, you know things like IBM WebSphere, old versions. IBM WebSphere is actually still in production, if you can believe it. It's the only way, really, I think, to talk to an AS400 these days. And yes, in Vegas, there are still some casinos and some banks that are running AS400. Hint for everyone that's going out to DEF CON, have some fun. The point here being is that these programs, especially client-server architecture, were developed with two things in mind. The first is the terms and conditions in terms of like the security of the application is completely within the organization. There's no shared responsibility here. You are responsible for the protection of those devices. The problem comes up with the fact that some of these are now beyond any sort of reasonable expectation of security. They weren't written with security in mind. They need local admin privileges in order to work. They need exposed ports and services. God forbid, even some of these applications have to use named pipes in order to communicate. And this is found in education, this is found in healthcare, this is found in national critical infrastructure. The technological debt for many organizations is the biggest security problem they face. You as a security department or an IT department can incredibly shore up the defenses of your organization by focusing in on supporting the improvement of and removal of items that are giving you technological debt issues, right? Especially, God forbid, you have to share some of this across the internet without adequate protections on it. To this very day, I see servers with VNC exposed. I see port 9100 on HP printers exposed on the internet. I see all of these sins from the past, and they are usually done. I'm not saying they're deliberately done. They are usually done as legacy stuff that supported a particular business case at the time. And in a lot of cases, it's not even relevant anymore and not necessary, but it has been forgotten about. You know, one of the major concerns that I have with organizations is when you do an external pen test and you do an Nmap scan of their ASNs, for instance, I'm talking about enterprise customers, and you see a bunch of stuff that you're like, Telnet, FTP, like VNC, what is going on here? Why is it still 1994 when I look at the infrastructure? And it's like, you're not going to do this, and you don't want to be, a terrible person about it, but you really need to get to the bottom of that, because these are the ways, the holes that the bad guys are going to leverage and break in. Now, this is, I think, more relevant to companies that are building their own software than it is sort of in general. But I will say, like, a lot of organizations have maintained in-house applications. They have their own software development team. Architecture now remains one of our biggest problems. And this is not just the current state, it's even our future state when we start looking at things like the metaverse and Web 3.0. Fundamentally, we have built the business services that we provide as IT and the, I'm going to say the assurance and the security functions on a very unstable foundation, right? One of the reasons why that foundation is unstable is the fact that we did not have the benefit of all of the modern capabilities that we've deployed in order to essentially compensate for that very shaky foundation that we built our applications on. So when I talk about architecture, I'm not just talking about the servers and the network. I'm talking about your enterprise architects that really need to interface with the business and understand the workflows and understand how that all comes together. And in a lot of cases, enterprise architects are now becoming a role that I've heard a few times, but it's called a BISO, a Business Information Security Officer. In a lot of cases, enterprise architecture and the BISO, or one and the same, are the folks that are responsible for seeing what the current state is and proposing a new state that reduces risk and security in the organization and elevates security in the organization. This is a critical task at the enterprise level. Now, the other part of this is this software architect who is really going to be working with the in-house application and the application development team, who is not only a security guru from the application development side, and I have the benefit with working with some of the best people through the beer farmers in the world on that, like world class. But this is what they were saying, is that if you're not educating your developers and you're not helping your developers code securely, then not only could you be creating an in-house risk, but if your software is being used by other organizations, that risk could be times a gazillion, right? You know, we saw what happened to SolarWinds. We saw what happened to Kaseya. Clearly, there was a bunch of work that needed to be done at the software architecture level to make sure that it wasn't exploitable and that the integrity of the development process was of primary importance, right? And then the infrastructure architect. Now, this used to be a pretty simple job back in the day, right? You basically had the internet, a firewall, and switching and servers, okay? Like, I'm piecing out 2 days, a week, maybe even 2 days a month, I'm good to go. Where it's gone really, I think, a lot more complex has been this move to hybrid and the move to the cloud. This is where you need a trusted vendor like our sponsor Rubrik and others in order to help you do this the right way. And it's a really difficult task. I am not disputing the fact because, first of all, and as your infrastructure architect and a Amazon infrastructure architect are going to be speaking like different languages for starters, because Amazon and Azure have names for different things and different functionality. And, you know, at the same time, that functionality can change. What was named something 1 month ago has now been end of life cycled and is being replaced by something else with different functionality. The infrastructure landscape of cloud right now is so dynamic that, you know, you need a trusted partner and a lot of knowledge to do this correctly. So you need the certifications, you need, people to call, you need trusted vendors to help you, especially on the infrastructure side, which includes, you know, things like backup and visibility and automation and orchestration and load balancing and all those things that we talk about in terms of IT operations have to be done securely. So your infrastructure architect has to have those security skill sets as well. And then the attack surface visibility of your organization. This translates directly back to not having a grip on ITAM, not having a grip on IT asset management, because the bad guys will come at you with Nmap and Shodan. There is no reason why you can't use Nmap and Shodan on your own infrastructure to get an appreciation of where you're at, what you have exposed, what kind of shape it's in, and whether or not it could be exploited and has known vulnerabilities, and what you're doing about gaining visibility on that. We are very blessed in the UK with a free service called Early Warning from the National Cybersecurity Center, where you can sign up, you can put your IP addresses in, your ASNs, and they are going to literally let you know if they see strange stuff that you've got exposed on your organization. In the United States, you've got CISA. If you're part of identified national critical infrastructure, they will do scans for you and give you that data in order to secure your organization. And what I love about that is when you get a third party that says your house is not in order, be it Her Majesty the Queen or, you know, the government of the United States telling you that you need to fix these things, it's a bit more of a compelling story. It's an easier sell within your organization to do this because literally the government, in one form or another, is telling you that there is work to be done, right? And that you have some exposure within your organization. This is especially important for enterprise organizations too, because if you protect yourself, you're actually protecting everyone that does business with you, and you're protecting your customers as well by not being patient zero of a massive supply chain compromise. Now, we also wanted to talk a little bit about data sprawl. There is a lot of work to be done here in terms of like DRBCP, because in a lot of cases, and this is like a terrible state of affairs, we are backing up data that is no longer relevant, no longer required, and not even operational. This is because the tradition of IT has been, we're doing a server upgrade. And what did that mean? That meant we're copying the shared drive disaster that we have, and we're moving it from one machine to another machine, and we're moving it intact with no thought about data archiving, with no thought about removing non-operational data or data that is quite simply out of date. I've been involved in massive server migrations, and I'm literally like, why are we copying Microsoft Works files over to this new server when we know no one has that software anymore within the organization? It's mind-blowing the level of data sprawl that we're dealing with, right? We've got data on mobile devices. We've got data on laptops. We've got data in databases that we're no longer even using. We are dying in data. And this is, I preface this by talking about and saying that data is going to be our largest struggle because it's all risk. When somebody steals 10,000, 20,000, 50 gigabytes, 150 gigabytes of your data, you don't know what is actually in there that can really hurt the organization. A lot of organizations don't. Oh, they took the whole shared drive. Oh my God, we have everything on our shared drive. This is sort of the legacy application issues, the legacy infrastructure issues all combined, and it really manifests and becomes a data cancer within your organization. Because if left unchecked, you're going to be spending a tremendous amount of time and effort, money and resources on backing up data that is no longer required, no needed. And then when you go to actually do a restore, whether it's a test restore or whether it's in a time of organizational crisis, you're going to find restoring terabytes of data is a terribly long process, right? You're going to be in a position where, we'll have that data back in 3 or 4 days, and you're like, it would have been cheaper to just pay the ransom and get the decryptor than having to restore all that data. So really, if people came to me and said, Ian, what is your sort of one enterprise cybersecurity tip? I think it's get on board, help the organization understand its data problem, and start really working on an archival process to lower the attack surface and to be able to bring services back online a lot quicker, rather than keeping all of the data that has ever been created by the organization on live platters. I'm telling you, focusing on the data sprawl issue will probably bring as many quick wins to your organization as dealing with that legacy infrastructure that nobody wants to talk about, right? The supply chain. So I said, as I'm getting down to the ninth ring race here of this, the supply chain, I think, is a discussion. It's around risk. It's around what can we do in terms of vendor onboarding, what kind of general cybersecurity checks, be it maybe security scorecard, can we use in order to gain some sort of level of assurance that our supply chain partners are doing the best they can with the resources that they have and making the best decisions they can with the information that they have at hand. This is really one of those areas which goes a lot beyond IT operations and even the security team, unless you start thinking about cyber threat. Because my belief is that knowing what's going on at your biggest customer, knowing what's going on with your biggest supply chain partners is all a part of gaining awareness of where you're sitting as a risk-based organization, and making sure that you have the ability to intervene before a problem goes toxic. It's like everybody's doing sort of brand awareness monitoring on Twitter. If somebody says something nasty about your company, hopefully your PR team, your marketing team will pick that up and will engage one-to-one off the public timeline with that individual that has a particular problem. We're talking about the same approach that we need to the supply chain. We're talking about awareness of the struggles of our partners and our customers so that we really can, be timely about it, react appropriately, and even, yes, provide resources if there is a scenario where that customer has suffered an impactful cyber attack, or that supply chain partner has suffered a substantial cyber attack, because no one can do it on their own. We need to pull together in order to really be successful. Now, one of the things that I frequently encounter, and these are sort of now my field observations, and we're going to get to, how we're going to fix this problem. But the field observations that I have is that, I go back to Bruce Schneier, who, sometimes the stuff he has to say is absolutely brilliant, but the worst enemy of security is complexity. And what have we done? Over the past 5 to 10 years, including the pandemic, we have made our networks more complex than they ever have before, supporting work from home, supporting third-party SaaS applications in a bunch of different hosting environments. We have built some of the most complex machines mankind has ever seen when it comes to the internet and all of the things that we've attached to it. So really, where we need to go is we need to take a pause as IT, because two of the competing interests of IT and IT security are really around IT gets incentivized to deliver IT projects on time and on budget, okay? The sooner they can close the ticket, the better, right, from their perspective. IT security needs to not become a disabler of IT's ability to deliver, but IT security needs to have a voice at the table to say, that's great that we're doing this, but we need you to build servers that are patched and updated before they go into production, not after the fact, because what happens is IT security provides the development department a bunch of servers. The development department creates an awesome application, something that's going to be, fantastic. IT security comes along, patches the infrastructure, and the app breaks. Okay? I've seen this in real life at enterprise levels of software. It should never happen, but it does. A lot of it happens to be because of different versions of TLS, or even different versions of the .NET security framework being updated on one box but not on other boxes is a great example. So again, when I talked about that convergence of IT management and IT security working together in harmony, and IT security providing them the guidance saying all of our servers need to be at this level in the development environment. All of our servers need to be regularly patched and updated with the critical patches that we require, especially ones that are under active exploitation, right? We need to convey that message, and conversely, we can't do it ourselves. We need to engage with IT in a very collaborative way in order to move that security ball forward. So my enterprise field observations. That first one is pretty harsh, folks, okay? You do not know what you're doing, okay? Now, I'm going to say in your own defense, it was probably because you haven't had the appropriate training for the tasks and delivery issues that you've been required. This is like saying, oh yeah, we have a SIEM, but it only deals with the on-premise firewall. It doesn't take any data from the cloud where, a third of our infrastructure now exists, right? Okay. So in some cases, the IT department, IT security department don't have the right training, possibly don't even have the right tools in order to carry out their mission effectively. That is the huge budget question that the CISO and the operations head of operations need to have a conversation. The CTO and possibly the CIO all need to talk about how are we bringing our team up to speed. What are the investments that we need to make from a training perspective or consulting perspective in order to make sure that not only are we doing this stuff securely, but we have knowledge transfer going on within the organization. That's the number one key. That's where I see things falling apart. And then for the in-house people, it is the fact that development and security are not aligned. I'm not saying they're against each other, but I'm saying what the developers need is a security resource in order to do secure coding and do testing and do QA that includes a security component before things go into production. Vice versa, IT can't just say, oh yeah, you've got 2 critical vulnerabilities on that application, we're not letting it go into production. That sets up a very adversarial relationship. It should never come down to that. Any critical vulnerabilities that are done in a dev environment should be dealt with before they get pushed to production. rather than having to have that off conversation saying, no, we're not letting it go through the uprights, right? So again, that's a really important aspect. I have a slide on ICAM. I'm going to skip that one for now because we are approaching the end of this, and I'll deal with it on that particular side. But again, what we need to talk about is no more flat networks, folks. The days of flat networks are over, gone. They are a legacy problem. They just need to go away. And of course, we always have to maintain compliance. So a few more points about we don't know what you're doing. Okay, so the problem is that there are going to be different levels of maturity within your organization, and everybody will say cybersecurity is important, but until you have a policy and the support of the business and the tool to understand when the policy has been violated, and some sort of method that you can put in terms of cybersecurity control to enforce it, you're nowhere, right? So again, even though I'll say you don't know what you're doing, it may be not just the IT security team and the IT operations, it's the business doesn't understand what they are doing from a security culture, but also from their own operational perspective. Buying a company and not involving IT security, and then IT security finding that there's tons of IOCs within their own environment is like a nightmare that nobody should have to deal with, yeah? Okay, the other thing too is secure development. So this is a big one, and it's a bit controversial because we are in a process where the development skills that are being taught in the university cannot, and fail to face real-world challenges when it comes to vulnerability and exploitation, right? So the reality is that the software developers within your own organization have to continuously update their skills, have to continuously be engaged with security, and that we understand that there are new languages out there, new frameworks that can be adopted that are going to be far more secure than the old stuff that we used to be doing in C+ or PHP and things like that. And again, a lot of, the big thing I see on the development and the infra side is you just disable security until it works, or you run things as root, which, again, we all know you're one privilege escalation away or one application compromise away from giving root access to an unknown person on your server. And that's the very definition of a terrible day. Again, like enterprise encouraging that software development lifecycle, that secure software development lifecycle, really involves a bunch of tools and collaboration between the security team. This is going to be a bit expensive, especially if you're going with some of the enterprise level stuff. I firmly would suggest that you engage experts in this field to find the appropriate solution that meets these requirements of things like SAST and DAST testing, or even just like basically as part of smoke testing your application, you run a vulnerability scanner against it. But again, that's, kind of not optimal. What should be happening within your organization is nothing that presents a vulnerability should be exposed to the internet. And there's tons of compensating tools that we can put in there as well. Part of this comes down to IT asset management and rules, right? And the documentation. I put the Obi-Wan Kenobi slide up there for a reason, because the documentation about what your external attack surface looks like through all of the different technology that you might have, like the firewall, the load balancer, the front-end server, the back-end server services, and all that needs to be documented. If you don't know why a database is on a server, and you look at the dates on that database and it doesn't look like any data has been written to it in a very long time, you need to ask the business, can this go away, right? Because, one of the major attacks that the bad guys are doing is they're stealing databases. And by having less, you lower your attack surface again and you run less risk, especially on legacy databases where they might be plain text, right? Absolutely critical. And again, documenting your vendors that may have VPN access into certain devices and constraining them. I mean, we go all the way back to the Target data breach. And what do we find? We find that the HVAC manufacturer support person had admin access and VPN into an entirely flat network. And that was, patient zero of what became a massive data breach for them, right? Segmentation. This is the big thing that we're talking about now in enterprise because it has so many benefits. It has benefits of like controlling what is accessing the internet, what is accessing internal resources, and making sure that you have the necessary rules to facilitate that, but at the same time alert if something is trying to do something that is trying to get out of that ring fence that you put there. When starting off your journey, a lot of Wireshark, a lot of PCAPs are going to be required. I've seen organizations put in line, a switch, mirror the port, the upstream port, so they can get an idea of what those boxes are talking to on a regular basis, right? Build a test lab. Be very careful when you're doing segmentation that you don't break Active Directory. Active Directory really does need a bunch of ports open. But at the same time, it can be secured, especially with bridgehead servers and other technologies that can be put in between, right? The other question to ask yourself is, should Workstation A be talking to Workstation B? This can be the case if you've got perhaps shared resources or printers or something like that. But generally right now, in order to prevent, a mass ransomware or data wiper outbreak, isolating your workstations into segmented groups and or completely isolating them from workstation to workstation communication is really the way forward. And again, when you're thinking about segmentation is useless without visibility on what may be trying to go somewhere that it's not supposed to. So again, logging in SIEM will become a little bit better in terms of the signal to noise ratio, especially if you're running it in segments, and especially if you're running it only on sort of the critical systems that your organization needs. And then, of course, compliance, right? Know the estate that you're dealing with, know what kind of threats you're going to face, know what controls you have deployed, and start fixing those gaps. The compliance department or IT audit department in your organization is going to be able to tell you what you're not good at, okay? Take that data and use it as business cases. Round up resources, project management office, IT operations, the CTO, the CIO. Go to those people and say, listen, audit's killing me on these particular issues. What can we do about it? How can we sit around the table and be aware and mitigate this particular threat? And then, finally, I love to say security is not compliance, but proof of the existence of your security is compliance. So really, it's critical that we get to that stage. Now, I've talked a lot about where we're at and given you some insight into where I think, some of the quick wins can be within your organization against that enterprise threat landscape. But let me just tell you that the biggest wins, and I'll underscore this, the biggest wins here that you can do within your organization comes down a lot to knowledge and a lot of knowledge transfer within your organization, but making the whole process part of the DNA of your company, right? The idea being that application development is going to be like the security piece of your organization is absurd. It's the whole organization has to be secured. Because as we learned from some data breaches, once that service is gone, everything else is up for grabs, right? And again, when I talk about and I lecture about this, I go beyond the idea of people, technology. I dig deep and I go the tech that you have, the tactics, the training, and the procedures. So T3P for the win. And that's going to involve service. That's going to involve mentality, mindset, and of course, that's going to involve leadership of the organization. And with that kind of whirlwind tour, we're going to go to some questions now. Thank you so much for having me. I hope everyone had a few takeaways from this webinar today. you there?
Oh, yeah, sorry about that. I was on mute. Yeah, we're right at the top of the hour, but I think we have time for just one question. What tools do you recommend for third-party supply chain analysts?
Right. So, okay, one of the tools is really simple. Have them fill out a cybersecurity questionnaire, not because it's, a ridiculous exercise, but because at least you have in writing what they said they were doing. Then try and get some third-party validation of that particular, those claims. So I do like security scorecard. I know it is a little bit controversial, but, I'm not going to quibble over if they're a 65 or a 66, right? I'm going to be really concerned if I see something down in the 40s or, if they're at the 90s. It's the balance of probabilities that everything behind the house is actually working and functioning correctly. But I think what we're going to see moving forward is we're going to have to get the council's office involved in some of the answers to those cybersecurity questionnaires that are coming out, because basically we can't be fraudulent. We can't knowingly deceive our business partners. So this is going to be a big issue, I think, moving forward. And of course, from the perspective of your company, having T's and C's that attempt to sort of reduce the amount of liability that you may face, and mechanisms like binding arbitration to have free discussions about failures that don't immediately end up in litigation, I think is one of the more powerful tools, right? I get it. There is always going to be nuance. I say there's very little uncertainty. There's a great deal of uncertainty in IT in general. But where we can agree on is if you do have, and you do state that you've got, endpoint protection on all of your endpoints, you can't maybe leave out the fact that you don't have it on your Linux infrastructure, right? It needs to be pretty comprehensive when you're dealing with that level. So benefit of the doubt, get it in writing, and, do some of your own third-party valuations and, talk in the community.
Okay, great. That's all the time we have. As always, thanks for the incredibly informative and engaging talk, Ian.
You're welcome. It's always my pleasure. I'm going to deal with one of those questions right now offline. Wish the next speaker all the very best, and have a great morning.
Everyone stay tuned. We're going to take a short break and be back shortly for our second session of the day, top tips and best practices for protecting and recovering your enterprise cloud. Take a chance to check out those resources on your console, and we'll be right back.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second session of the Modern Enterprise Cloud Security Summit. This event was organized by the hardworking folks at Redmond Magazine and Virtualization and Cloud Review, who have brought together some of the best independent experts on today's topic. Many thanks to our sponsor, Rubrik, for making this event possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief in the Converge 360 group of 1105 Media, and I'll be your moderator for the second of our 3 information-packed sessions. But before we get going with this session, just a quick reminder that each of today's sessions is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way within the next few days. This session will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Please feel free to add your questions as they occur to you throughout the summit. We'll do our best to get to all of them. Our sponsors provide some extra resources that can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a moment to check those out. And during our third session, one lucky attendee will be receiving a DJI Mavic 2 drone. The next big thing in aerial content creation that combines high-end imaging features and powerful flight performance in a compact form factor. This thing is so cool, I can't even read the script. But you must be present to win, so stick with us. Now let's get started with our second session, top tips and best practices for protecting and recovering your enterprise cloud. For this session, we called on Greg Schultz, founder and senior analyst with the IT infrastructure analysis and consulting firm Storage.io. During his 25-plus years in the IT industry, Mr. Schultz has worked with applications, servers, databases, networks, and storage. He has extensive experience with business continuity and disaster recovery, performance and capacity planning, and associated management tools for IBM mainframe, OpenVMS, Unix, Windows, and other environments. And somehow, he has found time to write several books, including Software-Defined Infrastructure Essentials. He's also a blogger and a sought-after speaker, and we are lucky to have him today. Take it away, Greg.
Hey, John, thanks a lot. Hello, and welcome everybody to the Modern Enterprise Cloud Security Summit and our focus session right now, right here today, top tips and best practices for protecting and recovering your enterprise cloud. So let's get started. We're going to fly through some of this stuff and get into the discussion, but here's the point. Here's the real thing. If the cloud is your organization's top attack vector, I love those terms, attack vector, can your cloud and data infrastructure, apps, data, and businesses survive an attack? How easy, quickly, and with what granularity can you recover, restore, restart, and resume your applications without causing a disaster in itself? So here's the thing. The key is being prepared. So what we're going to run through today is aligning data protection and recovery to applicable threat risks. We're going to talk a lot about how everything is not the same. Are you treating everything the same? There's different threat risks, different things that can happen, but also different impacts. So also we're going to get into balancing the cost of protection and recovery versus business enablement. And this will get into a little bit of, well, how do we convince management? How do we convince the bean counters that they need to actually invest in data protection recovery? Everything is not the same. However, are you treating everything the same? That ties directly to cost. If you're treating everything the same, you may be incurring cost while also not protecting or meeting your needs, your wants, your obligations. We're going to talk about evolving from old school to new school, including shifts in paradigms on how to protect. We're going to talk about trust, yet verify your recovery and restoration, and making sure everything is working, as well as what you can do today, preparing for tomorrow and beyond. So with that, let's just dive right in. So here's the thing. Take a step back. The big picture. I mentioned data infrastructure. What is that? The data infrastructure is the collection of resources, the hardware, the software, the tools, the practices, everything that collectively comes together that's configured to deliver the services that support the applications and data that in turn transform the information into those services that are consumed by the business. And the key focus here, the message is that when we talk about the data infrastructure, that could be on-prem, it could be in the public cloud, it could be a hybrid, it could be a multi-cloud, it could be virtual machine-based, container-based. Those are all just different stacks, layers, components that are part of that data infrastructure. In other words, data infrastructures are what exist inside the data centers, whether it be a cloud or you're on-prem or wherever that happens to be, that are configured. And it's all of these things that encapsulate what need to be protected, that need to be recovered, and with different granularity to protect against different threats. So we see across the bottom, and you're going to see these two graphics as we go through today, is horizontally, that's where the apps, the data, that infrastructure, where they exist. And it can span across from out at the edge to the core, on-prem into the different clouds, but also over there on the right, the different vertical, the different stacks, different layers, the different altitudes, the different areas of focus that you have to be aware of. As the person who is making decisions, architecting, designing, supporting, it's knowing about the different adjacencies of where things are at. And those adjacencies are both vertical, all the way down to the hardware, all the way up to the business applications, all points in between, but also spanning horizontally across those different segments, those different focus areas. Okay, so let's dig into this a little bit more. And as we go a little bit more into this, here's another way of looking at it. Cloud and data protection and recovery considerations. And our focus is around cloud protect recovery. You know, a question comes up, what's more important, Data protection or data recovery. Well, you can't do one without the other. And there's an old adage that I think is a very timely. We can always update it and turn it around and make it new and modern. But it's a basic premise of if you can't go back in time, how can your business go forward after something impacts? Or put it the other way, how can you go forward after something happens if you can't go back in time? Now, part of this is, well, how far back in time do we need to go? What granularity do we need to go? Do we need to go back and bring an entire system, an entire volume, an entire database, an entire email system? Do we need to rebuild? There's a whole bunch of things that start with R. Rebuilding, reconstructing, restoring, recovering, resuming, resiliency. We'll work those in as we go. But here's the thing. What are the applicable threat risks? There's a lot of different things that can happen. A lot of software-defined threats today, ransomware, malware, denial of service, death with them, all kinds of things out there. What needs protection? What level of protection? What granularity of protection? Do you need to protect it by minute, by the second, by the transaction, or by the hour, by the shift, by the day, the week, the month? There's different levels of protection that tie back to that granularity of what you need to restore back to. How and where are you protecting? How are you protecting for a given app, for a given focus area, but where are you protecting to? That's something that comes into play. And then there's these processes, rules, and policies, service level agreements, service level objective, recovery time objective, recovery point objective. We'll touch on these as we go. But also the notion that there's a difference between accessibility, availability, and durability. They're all interrelated. How long are you retaining information for, as well as how are you disposing of it? Are you focusing and including, as part of your thought process, Active Directory, SSO, single sign-on integration? What about intrusion detection and encryption, both at rest, in flight, where you're transiting the data while it's in memory, along with regulatory compliance? So these are all different things that play into what needs to be protected. Now, our title of this is Top Tips. Well, when are the tips going to come? Well, we've already rattled off a couple of them. Let's jump into some more. Real briefly here, we're not going to dwell on what all the different threats are, other than to say that we have these different threats and that they can apply to different organizations in different places. And the key one here is that different threats, different threat risks, if you like to use the vernacular, the buzzwords, different attack vectors and surfaces, things that can happen at different layers, at different altitudes, and different focus, thus the need for that different granularity. Because if something happens, if somebody deletes a file, do you need to bring back the entire system or just bring back that file, and from how far back? And what are the threats? They can be acts of man, they can be acts of nature, they can be intentional, they can be accidental, they can be technology failure, configuration. There's all these different things that can happen. That's why we want to focus on these different layers, these different areas. So the question that comes up is, clouds have a lot of resiliency, clouds have a lot of reliability, clouds have a lot of durability, clouds have a lot of security. All right, so then why do we need to focus on them? Well, real simple, it comes back to that granularity. What do you need to protect, and what do you need to be able to recover from, how, when, and what granularity? Are you protecting against, and you need to restore, again, from an entire system, an entire application landscape, which might span multiple systems, multiple components, multiple virtual machines or containers or services? Where are you restoring to, okay? Are you restoring from one cloud to the other? Are you restoring into an existing cloud? Are you going from on-prem to a cloud? Where are you protecting from, and where are you protecting to? As well as, what's the context? Is it a legacy? Is it a bare metal? Is it a virtual machine, container, or cloud-based service? But then what are you doing to protect your software as a service or your SaaS apps? What are you doing to protect O365, Salesforce, and other services? Now, you can say, well, geez, those are all protected. The vendor has protection. They've got their availability, their accessibility, their durability, and their security. Yeah, all those are great until they get hit with a denial of service attack. Or your auditors come along and say, hey, we like the fact that you're on O365. We love the information you're getting out of Salesforce. How quickly could we pull our data out if we had to because of a mandate or a concern, or they simply go off the air? And this is something that's been coming up more and more over the last couple of years is audits and others are coming in saying, how tied are we to a particular cloud? How portable? How locked in? How quickly could we move if we had to? How quickly could we move from AWS to Azure, or from Azure to Google, or from Google back to an on-prem or to a multi-high? Are we tied in? What are the dependencies that lock us in to a particular cloud, platform, service, or tool? So nothing wrong with being tied in, just being aware that that exists so that you do have that flexibility. So again, hence that focus across the different layers, the different environments. Now this ties back to the threat risk to your organization, having that insight, having that knowledge, having that awareness, and avoid flying blind when you're in the clouds. Having that insight, that situational awareness of what are those threats, what tech can fail, either by just the technology failing, or acts of man, whether they're accidental or intentional, or a misconfiguration. But part of it, too, is if you're in the cloud, what are the options that you're selecting? What defaults are you using, and what are you changing? Are you doing things that are undoing the cloud platform's recommended best practices and procedures and accidentally opening something up, leaving a port open or leaving a service opening, or not using different mechanisms that are there to help you? So it's about being aware of your environment. Again, that horizontal and that vertical view, having that insight of what are the different dependencies, what are the different adjacencies, and that understanding of what apps and what data are needed to support the business, both critically that have to be there, that there's a time delay, that they can be there as quickly as possible. Again, avoiding treating everything the same. So as we dig in a little bit deeper, this gets into the application aware and the granular protection, being able to protect against those different threat risks at different layers. I mentioned earlier is if all you need is a file brought back, whether it was deleted or found to be corrupted or infected, can you bring back an individual file? Well, what if the file you bring back is also damaged? How far back can you go to find a good version that is safe, is secure, that you can run security detection against it, check for malware, infections, or simple as data corruption? So can you bring back an individual file, or does it need to be a whole folder, a volume? Can you bring back a single database table versus having to bring back the entire database? Can you bring back an email box versus an entire email system? What's that granularity that you have available? And what's more important, optimizing for speed of protection versus speed of that recovery? Again, that's going to depend on that insight into your environment, into your application, and how the business relies on different things. That ties back into a business impact analysis, a BIA, if we like to throw acronyms around. Is understanding that relationship between the applications, the data, and how the business relies on them. Does everything need to be treated the same way, with the same recovery points, when they need to be recovered from, and in how much time, that recovery time objective? So there's a lot of different technologies and tools, hardware, software, cloud, network, server storage, different techniques like protection intervals, frequency and retention, replication, snapshots, consistency points, checkpoints, a lot of different options, but then it comes down to what do you configure? How do you turn those buttons, push those buttons, turn those knobs, twist those levers to get the environment to be what you need for the business to support the different applications. And some of that, well, it's just going to depend on what your business needs, what those environments are, but that's also where having tools that allow you, that have templates, that have that ability to say, here's how you can quickly get deployed to set things up for a transactional environment, or for a analytics environment, or for a office type environment, or file sharing. That's where those things start to come into play. All right. So again, part of this is we're still talking about the whys, but we're also talking about how to do it here, which is understanding your needs versus your wants. And this is a classic. You ask the business units, well, what do you need for protection? They're going to tell you, I need recovery time objective, an RTO of 0, instantaneous. And I need a recovery point objective, RPO, of now. Okay, great. Are you able to pay for that? Can your functionality, your use of it, justify that? And they're like, well, that's what we want. Well, great. Now let's go to the needs. Because if you can get a business unit, if you can get somebody involved in that discussion between needs versus want, what do you want, what would you like, versus what do you need, what do you require? And then now you can start to apply what is that business cost, that business benefit, that business enablement. And this is where the fun comes in of bringing the financial people, the business ownership in. And what you'll find out is that, well, the customer wanted this, and you heard that they wanted that, so you took that as a need, only to find out that's what they wanted. That's what they would have liked to have had, where it turns out their requirement is different. And you may find out very quickly that some things are being, well, overprotected, while other things may be being starved. They're not getting the right protection to enable them to be more resilient, to have a better business benefit. So it's a small little concept, but it is the key to helping to justify and looking at understanding the business, the apps, the data, their dependency, and how do you get that cost? Well, you have that discussion and you get the financial people involved, because then if they say, well, let's cut some costs here, guess whose shoulders it's on? The financial people. And when they start to understand that there's the benefit, that enablement, let them help, get their fingers on it, and that's how you help to justify it. So again, we're going to protect at different locations, different points. I've mentioned RPOs, RTOs, recovery point. Where do you need to recover back in time to so you can go forward? That recovery time, how quickly can you get there? Now, here's a key point I want to bring out. When it comes to recovery time, is that for a component? Is that for a given layer? For example, the physical, the hardware, the virtual, the containers, they need to have an RTO of a certain amount of time. Great. Check the box, mission accomplished, high fives. But wait a minute. What about the layer that sits above it, the file system, the databases? What's their recovery time? Okay, they've met, check the box, all's good. But wait a minute, what about the apps that sit above that and anything else in that horizontal or that vertical layer over there on the right? So you can have RTOs that are component, that are layer focused, but ultimately for that consumer of that business service, they're going to be concerned about their RTO of when they can get back to work and where is their data at a particular point in time. So you want to keep those two in focus, in view of that component base, that the different layers have an RTO and an RPO, but also that holistic of when is everything done, which could be different by minutes, seconds, or even hours. So something to keep in perspective. Something else to think about is what are you protecting against and the relative risk to a different applications and its value. This goes back to that business impact assessment. Is how many faults or failures to tolerate? Well, you can design in a lot of durability, a lot of availability, a lot of accessibility, but is that what that particular app needs versus what somebody wants? Likewise, somebody might be focused on something from a cost cutting only to realize that that's a key function of the business, so invest in it to enable that app to be available because there's a business benefit. So a couple of other ones here real quick: mean time to repair, mean time to restart, mean time to restore. And what I really like to focus on is that mean time to resume, to get the business back going, whether it's the whole business or just that app that had an impact. So part of this is the shifting from old school disaster recovery to what we'll call current era business continuance. Let's get things going again. We'll shrug off, we'll deflect, we'll keep the business going, to where we're really at and going, which is that business resilience, always on, always going, to meet the needs of the business. All right, so we've touched on granularity. We're going to touch on it again. It's one of those key things, is that frequency, that coverage. But also, when are the protection going to be done? The backups, the consistency points, the snapshots, the checkpoints. When are they going to be done? Are they automated? Can they be initiated by a user? Can that user also initiate a restore? And does that restore need to be that whole restore, or just selecting an individual table or an individual file or an individual component to be brought back? And how is this going to be done across different environments, across that horizontal, but also up and down that vertical stack across those different layers? And again, where are your costs? Okay, understand your costs. To understand your cost with the cloud and with data protection, needs to understand the business, the apps, how they're being used, how they're configured. Are you starving some apps from performance, from availability, in the interest of cutting costs, versus enabling some of those that have more of a benefit and looking for other areas to remove some complexity and reduce costs? So also tied into that is, where are you going to restore and recover to in these different environments? All right, moving along. So again, it comes up, well, clouds, they've got a lot of availability. What you have to keep in mind is that availability, whether it's cloud availability or on-prem or at the edge or even at home, availability is accessibility plus durability. And real simply put, accessibility, can you get to something? Durability is, you can get to it, and is it intact? Does it have integrity? Is it safe? Is it free of faults, malware? Is it safe? Those two things, durability, accessibility, equals availability. Part of the availability means fault containment, fault isolation, granular recovery and restoration. And that means having layers of defense, layers of security, layers of protection, with different granularity, such that you can isolate and you can contain things that happen, that you've got that ability to go back in time and bring back things with different granularity depending on what happens. So as we look at this again, here's just a quick look at some different approaches. Are you going from on-site to the cloud? Are you going from one cloud to another cloud? Are you going cross-cloud, multi-cloud? Are you going from the edge to the core? There's a lot of different options. There's a lot of different scenarios that you can do. How do you decide? How do you know what tools to use, when, where, why, and how? Again, that comes back to understanding the environment, understanding the business, having that business impact assessment. There's a lot of talk about the data. Well, there also needs to be more talk about the apps and the data and their settings and their configuration, because those combined are how you get information and how you get the app services. So this also comes from being able to sit down with different advisors, different consultants to help you walk that through, but also with different tool providers that have the ability to help you with the insight, to be able to avoid flying blind, so that as you're flying, you've got good instruments that you can fly with, but that those instruments have good, accurate, and timely data, so that you're not flying blind amongst the clouds and that you've got that situational awareness that you can see something has happened, you can make that decision, and look, hey, we've got options. Here's what's happened. Here's what we think the extent, or we know the extent of the damage or destruction or loss or deletion, whatever that happens to be, that now you've got that granularity to be able to choose from and put things in action. And this is part of that reimagining, that rethinking data protection, backup recovery. You can take that recovery, you can take backup and substitute snapshot, checkpoint, consistency, replication, whatever you want in there, and you can substitute recovery for restore, rebuild, resume, restart, okay? But it's all about keeping the business and its apps, its data, the information services running. So again, part of this is leveraging what's built into the cloud and leveraging more granularity, reducing the cost of data protection without compromise. And what that means is simply cutting costs to meet costs. You may be impacting the business as opposed to figuring out, do all applications need to be treated the same with the same availability, accessibility, durability, protection intervals, RTOs, RPOs, or can different things be treated differently? And that's how you also support growth of more apps and data and enable more versions, time intervals of copies to be made, and to be able to protect against different legacy as well as emerging threats. And it's also the step to start using new and old technology in new ways. We'll touch more on that in just a moment. So it's evolving the business and resiliency to an always-on working. So again, the theme is top tips. Well, you've been getting some tips here, and I think it's time to give you a few more. So let's talk more about rethinking, reimagining data protection. It's boosting the performance and reducing time for that restoration. How do you do that? Simple. Granularity. If all you need to do is bring back a file, an email, a database table, then set up your protection to facilitate that. Leverage the tools from the vendor so that you don't have to do a brute force recovery because you did a brute force protection. This is where that granularity comes into play. Also, leveraging that application. Not everything needs to be done down in the storage systems or down in the storage servers or in the operating system or the file system or in the database. You can leverage application database tools. Leverage them all in harmony to protect at different layers against different threat points, and you've got that granularity. So again, are you treating everything the same, or can you start to look at things differently? Now, there's a balancing point. On one hand, treating everything the same, one template, one approach, one size fits all, it's easy. It may be more costly, but it's easy, relatively speaking. Okay. On the other hand, you could go overboard and have a lot of different environments, a lot of different options, a lot of different settings, a long list of menu protection options. Now you're introducing complexity. Where's the magic balance? It depends on your environment, where your needs are, and what you're protecting against. And again, this is where getting the business units involved, getting the business units, the financial people, the auditors, if they're going to come around, the auditors, and tell you what's right and what's wrong, great. Get them involved early. Get their hands involved so that, well, if they come back and complain about something, it's like, well, geez, didn't you make that recommendation? Get involvement from them. All right, let's talk about gaps. Okay, so with data protection and recovery, there's a couple of different kinds of gaps. There's the good, bad, and the ugly. All right, so good gaps are things like air gaps, where you're isolating, and time gaps. Air gaps where you've got a protection copy, a backup, a snapshot, a replica that's offline, maybe offsite. Physically, it cannot, or logically, it cannot be impacted, attacked, infected. It's safe and secure, okay? So that means not only the data, but it also means having copies of your apps, their settings, their configurations, your Active Directory, all your different components that are needed. A time gap is good because that's that interval that you're going to go back to that point in time, that recovery point from where you're going to be able to restore from. If you go back a week and say, you know what, that version was corrupted. Go back 2 weeks, that version was corrupted. Well, having those versions, there's a cost to it, but then there's also that business enablement. So those are green, those are good gaps. The yellow, which can be bad, a gap in time. In other words, find out that, yeah, you've got missed recovery points, that the protection wasn't actually running. For whatever reason, something didn't get copied, something didn't get protected for some period of time, a configuration, an error, whatever it might be. There could also be gaps in coverage, which are very similar, that you thought something was being protected, but it wasn't. And the gaps in consistency that, yeah, something was protected, but what was protected may be corrupt, infected, that there might be some other issue with it. So both the green and the yellow, the green is good. The yellow, we need to get those taken care of. Then we go into the ugly. The ugly are recovery gaps. What you thought was recoverable turns out to really be missing. It was completed. It was damaged. And this goes back in time. In other words, you didn't catch it while it was still in that yellow category. So we want to be aware of there are different kinds of gaps when it comes to data protection and how you leverage those. All right, so real quickly here's just a visual of protecting at different vertical layers for different reasons at different points in different points in time. And if you look at on this chart that there's that vertical of protecting at different layers, using different tools, technologies, and at different fine grain. At an application layer for certain business function, it might be very granular, recurring quick snapshots. You might have other things running on a coarser basis. So again, avoid treating everything the same. And here's where we start to evolve from old school to new school. And what this is all about is to start leveraging and using new tools, new software, new platforms in new ways. Far too often, something new gets used in an old way. You get a new solid state, you get a new cloud. Well, how is it used? Kind of like how you used to use tape. So in other words, you swapped out a technology that's newer, cooler, faster, but yet you're using it in the same way. So part of this thinking is to start looking at technology and using it in new ways. For example, how can you do things in a more granular approach? How can you speed up the protect and the recovery? Well, leveraging that granularity. The other is you've got a lot of data. Well, how much of it can be archived? How much could be moved to a different tier so you're not having to brute force as much? Anyway, I mentioned the old school, the classic, 3-2-1, a grandfather, father, son, grandmother, mother, daughter, however you want to look at it, approach to protection, which is 3 or more copies on 2 or more devices and at least 1 off-site. Let's evolve this to at least 4 or more versions, 3 or more copies, and you could swap those 2 around. You could have 4 copies, but at least have those versions. The key is that we're putting emphasis on not only copies, but versions, those points in time, as well as having those on different systems, devices, platforms, and at least 1 off-site, on the cloud or air-gapped, which could be on the cloud or somewhere else. Here's a visual of it. So it's really about highlighting that it's not just about having more copies. It's having more usable versions and copies so that you know they're all out there and that you can test them, that you can verify them, make sure that they're all working, and have those offline, off-site capabilities. All right, so again, this is using the new and old things in new ways. It's just rethinking versus simply replacing what you have and using it the same way. Take that step back. What can be impacted and how, and what's the impact to the business? Stepping back and looking at it, do we need to do things like we always have? Why can't we start doing things in new ways? And again, having that situational awareness, avoid flying blind. Yeah, use your instruments, but make sure they've got good and timely insight, that you've got those metrics, your service level objectives, service level agreements, your RTOs, RPOs, mean time to repair. And are the metrics compound or aggregating, and are they across that horizontal as well as across that vertically? And leveraging the automation tools to address the routine so you can focus on the exceptions as well as refining new policies, procedures. Again, trust yet verify. The key thing here is, can you test something, test a restore without causing a disaster? And does it take a veteran, a very seasoned, experienced person to be able to do this? Or can you have a junior admin or an intern be able to do the procedure without causing a problem? Do you have an environment for testing as well as training where you can restore and test and improve on how things run? And the key is, don't cause a disaster as a result of restoring and testing. All right, so we're going to start to wrap up so we can do a few questions and answers. And wrapping up for now, again, not everything is the same, so why treat it the same? Get the business involved. Do that impact analysis of the apps in the business. Where do they relate? What's important? If the financial people are coming to you and saying, this is too expensive, well, get them involved early. If the auditors are telling you it's not the right way, get them involved earlier. Get them involved. Work in those adjacency areas that we talked about horizontally as well as vertically. So it's really important to know the biz and the app requirements and the different workloads. The best solution is the one that works for you. The best configuration is the one that supports your business needs and can keep those different layers, granularity, and perspective. Where can you learn more? StorageIO.com, StorageIOblog.com. Check out my books. I've got several of them out there. 3 of them are highlighted there. I've also got a couple of others. I'm on Twitter, Facebook. There's my email address. Happy to entertain any questions you might have. But with that, hey, John, do we have some time for some questions?
We sure do, Greg. Hey, thank you so much. That was fascinating. Yeah, we do. So we're going to take some questions now. I want to remind our attendees that you can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. Let's start with this question here. Why not just use and rely on the cloud service like AWS or Azure for cloud data protection and recovery?
It's a great question, a common question, and the common answer is you can. And more importantly, pay attention to their cookbooks, their templates, their best practices of what to do, what not to do. But why would you want to supplement that? More granularity. To be able to abstract, say, from an Azure or from an AWS, to have a level of abstraction such that you can have your app in either location. You're not tied to AWS, you're not tied to Azure, that you're not tied to the public versus the hybrid, that you can work across those different environments. You might have VMware, you might have some Hyper-V, some Windows. Well, the more you latch onto a particular platform, now you have to kind of work in that context. So you want to leverage the cloud, but leverage in another layer that gives you that more flexibility.
Fascinating. I got a quick question. How many people do you think really understand the shared responsibility model, the fact that Microsoft's responsible for the cloud, for the Azure cloud, but you're responsible for what's in it?
Yeah, I think it's improving. I think it's getting better, especially the more we have these sessions. And what it comes down to it is, okay, so you're Microsoft. Well, are you Microsoft Azure-centric or are you Microsoft in general-centric? Well, there comes in. Do you get pulled into everything has to be under Azure Arc, or are you looking at it from more pragmatic that I'm going to use Windows Admin Center. That gives me that level of flexibility, or that I want to go a little bit more abstract. But it also comes back from moving out of these silos that I'm the server person, I'm the container person, I'm the virtual machine, I'm the network, I'm the security. You know what? Great. Congratulations. Attaboy, attagirl. Learn and work in those adjacent areas horizontally as well as vertically, up and down. If you're the VMware expert, learn about Hyper-V, learn about other aspects. Whatever your area is, make it a focus to have and be part of that, for lack of a better term, a virtual team.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, fascinating. Thank you. So Mitchell is asking, so keeping 3 copies of backups in-house and off-site? He must be asking if that's good enough or if that's what he should do.
Yeah, so here's what it comes down to. What's the value? What's the value of that data? Is it something that you could afford to lose, or that it's really not that valuable? Well, then you can rethink it. On the other hand, that it might be very, very valuable. Well, guess what? Then you want to have more copies. But it's not just the number of copies. It's having copies of the different versions and vice versa. So this is where the financial concerns is, hey, that's going to cost a lot. Yeah, I know. But do you need to have 3 copies of everything from yesterday, even though it hasn't changed in the last year? The answer is probably no. That you might be able to go to a more coarse protection for those things that aren't changing that often, such that those things that are changing more frequently, yeah, now you can start to do it. And that's where leveraging different tools, technologies also comes into play, reducing that footprint, reducing that impact. Though I have 3 copies of backups in-house as well as off-site, I've got 3, for some things I have at least 3 copies of, and multiple versions, and I've got them not only on-prem, I've got them in different locations and not just on the cloud. Stop eating my own dog food.
So that's good to hear, actually. So Vic is wondering, and look, you talked about, this is a good question, but you talked about this during your talk, but I think it maybe bears repeating the form of this question. What's more important to focus on, the backup protection or the recovery?
This is a chicken and egg, and if you talk to a backup person, they're going to probably say, well, it's of course backup. You talk to recovery, well, guess what? It's both. And here's the thing is, rather than getting into one's more important than the other, put the two together, abstract it, and now how do we reimagine not just the data protection, the data recovery, business resilience, that business continuance? How do we get more towards that continued with that focus also on the different applications environment? You can't do one without the other.
Fascinating. Okay, let's see here. Mitchell is wondering, he says, I have a NAS system and several backup media. Individual computers I'm not concerned about because I don't allow them to keep company information on them. File server and database server is all I am concerned about.
That's a good approach. I mean, I do similar where there is stuff I keep, for example, on workstations, laptops, tablets, but they're also protected elsewhere. There is a copy of anything critical, and there's also, I have certain virtual machines, certain containers that my protection approach is I can rebuild them quickly, but the data, the apps are elsewhere so that I can rebuild them. So again, it's that granularity, but wherever I'm protecting something too, I have more than one NAS system. Some are backups or just a copy of something else. Here's something to think about. There's a concept of, I'm just going to make that NAS system super resilient, super redundant. Great, good, congratulations. What happens when you get a file system corruption? Well, those never occur. Really? I had one recently. Bother me because I had another copy. I had another version. Just do the restore, run a check disk, whatever it happened to be, off and running.
Yes. Okay. Tori's wondering, how do we justify the cost of more copies and versions? Speaking of which, our budgets are shrinking and data is growing.
Yeah, I love this one. It's that needs versus wants. If you're just going to continue to brute force it, you're chasing something that you may not be able to catch. So you have to step back and rethink, what are you protecting? Why are you protecting it? how often, for how long, all those things, and how much is actually changing. Rethink it, reimagine that such that can you start to use all this new technology in a new way by changing your policies, your procedures, what needs to be protected, when, where, why, and for how long, and how you're keeping it. Mm-hmm. Can I archive? Just take some data, send it to an Azure, put it on an Azure blob, but if it's something that hasn't changed in a year, I'm moving it to the Azure archive ice cold tier where it's very low cost. If I need it, I know it's there.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. Okay, Rhea is asking this question. This has got to be a universal concern. Management does not see the benefit of investing in extra cloud data protection. What can we do to change their thinking?
Real simple. Ask management, what systems can they live without and for how much time? And if they don't know the answer, you've got to figure that out. Does management know what the cost of downtime is? But does management, even more important, does management know what the value, the business benefit of an application, a resource being available? Okay? You get management to know that. They may or may not know. They might send you to the finance people. I'm not picking on the finance people. You can leverage them. They can work with you. And, if they've got that knowledge, they can help work through some of this and put it to the point where then you do an ROI, TCO, an ROI type model where you show them that, hey, by doing this, not only can we afford it, we help the business, but by doing things a certain way, we might be able to prepay some of our expenses and get a huge discount.
Mm-hmm. That is great advice. Greg, looks like that's all the time we have for questions for this session. Many thanks to Greg Schultz, founder and senior analyst at Storage.io, for a great session, and to our sponsor, Rubrik, for making it possible.